Welcome to Sleep Stories' Restless Minds. Tonight's story is set in the golden hush of the western frontier, where slow trains pass through quiet towns and wind speaks through cottonwood trees. In this soft and dreamy tale, we follow a gentle soul traveling a railroad line that time is slowly forgetting. Along the way, they meet a world worn by sun and softened by silence, where every porch has a memory and every mile hums with calm. So settle in, let your eyes grow heavy, and join us as we ride the quiet tracks of wild. Whistle down the cotton line. Your journey begins now. Part 1, the train that only ever left. There wasn't much left of Dalton Station. Just a leaning water tower, a split bench, and a platform that sagged at the middle like it had been holding its breath for decades. The tracks, silvered and thin, ran straight through cotton grass and prairie wind, disappearing east into nothing and west into nothing else. The train came at dusk. It always did. No whistle, not anymore. Just the low hush of iron on old rails, wheels whispering like a memory long past due. It never stopped. Not fully. It only slowed. And each evening, just before the sun slipped behind the soft rise of hills, someone climbed aboard. This evening, that someone was a man with a quiet hat and a quieter past. He carried no bag, just a book in one pocket and something heavy in the other that he hadn't touched in years. No one asked his name. There was no conductor, no other passengers, just the train. The car he stepped into smelled of warm dust and wood polish, the kind rubbed in by hands that remembered how things used to shine. He sat by a window where the glass was scratched by time and flecked with dust motes, glowing soft in the amber light. Outside, the cottonwoods leaned gently in the wind, the prairie endless, and the train rolled on. Not fast, not loud, just steady. The kind of travel that didn't mean to take you far, just elsewhere. As the horizon turned blue, then violet, then the kind of black you only see where cities have never been, the man tipped his hat low and closed his eyes. The rhythm of the tracks was like breath, and the night rolled in like sleep. Part 2, the passenger log. Morning came slow across the prairie. It didn't arrive with noise or color, just a long stretch of light over dry grass and distant hills, like a thought returning after a good long sleep. Inside the train car, the man stirred. He hadn't truly slept, just drifted. Like the train, like the wind. A thin beam of gold slanted through the window and lit the seat across from him, where a book now rested. He hadn't noticed it the night before. Leather-bound. Edges worn. A silver plate on the front read, Passenger Log. Dalton Line westbound. He opened it slowly. There were names written in different hands, some neat, some barely legible. No date, no destination, just names. Some pages were stained, others torn, and a few had dried flowers pressed between them. At the bottom of the current page, a line had been left blank. His fingers hovered over it. He didn't write his name. Not yet. He turned to the last filled page and traced one with his fingertip. Miriam carried a song she never sang out loud. He smiled barely. That was how these names worked, it seemed. Not just who you were, but what you carried. He looked back at the blank line, still untouched. The train clicked softly as it moved, swaying side to side like an old lullaby. He set the log gently on the seat, as if someone else might need it soon. He didn't need to be remembered. Not yet. Outside, the land passed in waves of yellow and silver. Cotton fields faded to dust, then to mesquite, then back again. The kind of places you can only get to if you're not really going anywhere. Part 3, the station with no town. By late afternoon, the train began to slow, not sharply, just enough to let the wind catch up. Outside the window, a small station appeared, 3 posts holding up a sagging roof, a faded sign hanging crooked from chains. Waypost. No time, no schedule, just waypost. The man stood, stretched the sleep from his shoulders, and stepped down from the train as it rolled to a gentle near stop. His boots crunched on gravel dust. No one else got off. No one else had to. There was no town, just the station. A crate sat near the edge of the platform, with a hand-painted note, Take what you need. Leave what you don't. Inside, a broken compass, a tin of hard candy, a needle and thread, a pair of child's gloves, and folded neatly at the bottom, a hand-drawn map with nothing marked but a question mark in the middle. The man took nothing, but he added something. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a small photograph face down in the crate, the kind of photo that faded more in memory than in light. He dusted his hands, stepped back aboard, and sat down in the same seat as before. The train began moving before he had even settled fully. The cottonwoods outside leaned just the same as yesterday, but he felt lighter. The logbook across from him still sat open to the same page. He looked at the empty line, and though he still didn't write his name, he whispered it once softly to the window, not to be heard, just to remind himself he still had it. Part 4, The Lady with the Porcelain Hands. The train didn't pick up speed after Waypost. It didn't need to. The man sat with his head resting gently against the window, eyes half closed. The prairie had begun to shift. Less cotton, more scrub, more open sky, the kind that made you feel like the land had forgotten how to end. Somewhere between miles, he felt it. A shift in weight. Someone had boarded. He opened his eyes, and sure enough, across from him sat a woman. She wore a gray traveling coat, buttoned neatly, and white gloves that looked as though they'd never held anything heavier than a teacup. She nodded to him once, then looked out the window. He returned the gesture, politely. This was not a train for conversation, not unless the silence asked for it first. Her hands rested in her lap, still and perfect. Porcelain, he thought. Not literally, but close enough. Hands that hadn't held grief in years and still remembered the shape of it. After some time, she pulled a folded letter from her coat, opened, worn at the corners. She didn't read it, just held it, like something she had meant to let go of, but the time had never felt quite right. The man reached into his own coat pocket and touched the small, heavy thing he'd carried since Dalton. Still there, still unopened, still waiting. The woman never said a word. But before the sun fell behind the far hills, she stood and moved to another car, quiet as smoke. When he glanced down at the seat she'd left, the letter was gone. But a single glove remained, set carefully on the windowsill, facing outward, as if waving goodbye to nothing at all. Part 5, The Clock in the Cottonwood. Night had settled again, soft and sure, with the kind of hush that only empty land could offer. The man sat still in his seat, the glove across from him glowing pale in the moonlight. The logbook had slipped to the floor, its spine open like a tired mouth. The train slowed once more. No station this time. Just a lone cottonwood tree, tall and elegant, its limbs reaching wide over a clearing where the tracks curved gently like a question left half-asked. The train paused, not stopped, just still enough. The man stepped down. The air smelled of cedar and dust. The cottonwood stood at the center of the clearing, and there, tied gently around its broad trunk, was a clock. A simple round one set in a rusted frame. Its hands ticked softly, but the numbers were all the same. 12. 12. 12. 12. He ran his fingers across the face. The hands moved, but the hour never changed. A tag dangled from the bottom of the clock. Time doesn't pass here. It pauses. The man took off his hat and stood beneath the tree. He didn't think. He just rested. For the first time in longer than he could name, his mind went still, not empty, but unworried. When he finally returned to the train, the glove was gone from the windowsill. But the logbook had been set neatly back in its seat, as if someone had straightened it with care. He sat, closed his eyes, and the train began to move again, as quiet as breath in a sleeping room. Part 6, The Postmaster's Lantern. By morning, the train approached another stop. This one had a name carved into a leaning board, almost swallowed by climbing vines. Linden Hollow population unknown. No one waited at the platform, but the station was intact, a small cabin with a wide porch, its windows glowing softly as if they remembered sunlight better than the sky did. The man stepped off the train and followed a narrow path to the porch, where a lantern swung gently from a hook unlit. Beside it, a rusted post box stood open. Not empty? Inside were letters, dozens, all addressed in fine cursive. None had stamps. None had been opened. He took one at random and turned it over. No return name. Just a single line on the back. For someone who almost asked. He didn't open it. He just held it. There was something about these letters that felt unfinished, like sighs or prayers caught before they reached the air. On the windowsill of the station was a small journal and a stub of pencil. A sign beside it read, "If you want to leave a letter, you don't have to write it. Just remember it." He stood there for a long time, remembering. Then he touched the journal once, gently, as if the act alone had said enough. The lantern above him flared to life for just a moment, soft and amber, then flickered out again. He turned back toward the train. It was already ready. The engine let out a low breath of steam, and the man stepped aboard once more. He sat in his seat, looked out the window, and for a brief second, as the train pulled away, he thought he saw someone sitting on the station porch, just waving. Part 7, The Suitcase of Wind. The train drifted along through the late afternoon, sun slanting low and wide across the plains. The land had begun to soften again. Taller grass now, fewer fences, more open in that way that made you feel watched only by the sky itself. The man remained in his seat, hands folded on his lap. Opposite him, where the woman had once sat, now rested a suitcase. He hadn't seen anyone place it there. It was small, leather, worn smooth at the edges and entirely unremarkable, except for the way it hummed. Not with sound. With air. A slight draft stirred from its seams as though the suitcase was breathing out slowly, or holding in something lighter than air. Tied around the handle was a tag. "Do not open. It's already leaving." He didn't touch it, but he leaned toward it slightly and closed his eyes. And he felt it, wind that didn't belong inside a suitcase. The kind of wind that passed through wheat fields before harvest. That moved curtains in rooms left alone. That blew out candles when no one was watching. It wasn't trapped in there. It was just passing through. The man sat back again. Whatever the suitcase carried, it wasn't his to claim or lose. It would be gone by the next stop. He could feel that. He pressed a hand to the window, warm from sun. Outside, a crow flew low over the prairie, riding a breeze that hadn't been there moments ago. And the train continued west, steady as the breath between thoughts. Part 8, The Man on the Water Tower. The landscape had changed again. The train curved through a dry basin where nothing moved except the shadows of clouds. The sun hung low, wrapped in that dusty gold that makes everything feel older, even the sky. The man glanced up from the logbook, which he'd been idly flipping through. It was now filled with names he didn't recognize, and yet each one felt like someone he might have passed in another life. As the train rounded a bend, a tall, rusted water tower came into view, its legs thin as bird bones, its tank bowed and streaked with age. And there, seated atop it, was a man. Just sitting, hat tilted, legs dangling. He didn't wave, didn't move, but he was watching. Not the train, just waiting. The train didn't stop. It didn't slow. But for a moment it felt as though the world had held its breath, long enough for both men to see each other. The traveler on the train, the watcher on the tower. And in that quiet stretch of time, something passed between them. Not a greeting, not a warning, just a kind of understanding that doesn't need words. Then the train rolled on, and the water tower fell out of view. The man on the train sat back in his seat. A breeze shifted through the car, and he noticed the suitcase of wind was gone. No sound, no mark, just space left behind. He looked out the window again, half expecting the man on the tower to still be there. But the prairie only held shadows now. and the steady whisper of rails that never asked where you were headed, only how gently you were willing to go. Part 9, The Bridge That Sank in Fog. The train slid into evening with its usual grace, barely a sound save for the soft hush of iron on iron, the low hum that settled into the bones like a lullaby. The man had dozed for a while, then woken slowly, the way one does when time doesn't matter. Outside, the landscape had become harder to see. Fog had rolled in, thick, slow, and silver. The train began to cross a bridge, or what remained of one. The wooden beams creaked, long and low. Beneath them, not a river, not a canyon, but a blanket of mist so dense it looked like snow frozen in mid-fall. The windows fogged over gently. The man wiped a small circle clear and peered out. There were shapes in the mist. Not people. Moments. He saw a rocking chair swaying gently on an invisible porch. A pair of boots neatly left side by side. A child's hat drifting like a leaf caught in thought. These weren't memories. They were things people had forgotten to forget. The train slowed, not from caution but respect. A sign appeared just before the midpoint of the bridge, painted in long slanted strokes. You are now crossing what you once let go. The man closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. The bridge creaked once more beneath them. The mist pressed against the window like a sigh. And then they were through. The fog thinned, the stars returned quietly, and the land stretched out ahead once more, open and wide. The train picked up its usual pace, not fast, just faithful. And the man leaned back in his seat, feeling something within him had been crossed too. Part 10, The Woman with the Feather Hat. The stars were bright that night, unbothered by clouds or lamps or time. They scattered across the sky like they'd been gently placed there just before dusk. Inside the car, the man found himself joined by another presence. A woman now sat across from him. He hadn't seen her enter, and she hadn't made a sound. But there she was, tall, composed, with a wide-brimmed hat decorated with a single feather. The feather was blue-gray, the color of dusk clouds, and it trembled ever so slightly with the motion of the train. She held no luggage, only a folded fan and a coin purse that looked too old to still carry money. They sat in silence. After some time, she reached into her coat and drew out a pocket watch, small and silver. She didn't open it. She just ran her thumb over the lid, which bore a faint engraving. Too soon, too late, just in time. The man tilted his head gently as if to ask. She met his eyes just once, then smiled, not sadly, not brightly, but with the warmth of someone who'd seen too many sunsets to be surprised by another. And then, softly, she placed the pocket watch on the seat between them. It ticked once, then stopped. She rose, tipped her hat with grace, and walked to the end of the car. Before disappearing through the door, she turned back and spoke. Not loud, but clear enough to carry. This line always runs west, but not every passenger does. Then she was gone. The man looked down at the watch. Still, but no longer broken. Just at rest. He picked it up, not to keep, but to remember. And outside, the stars seemed to shine just a little quieter. Part 11, The Diner with No Doors. Morning arrived with golden light and the low hum of the world waking up slow. The man sat quietly, hands resting over the stop pocket watch, now placed gently atop the logbook. Outside the window, the prairie rolled on like a soft sea, rising in low waves of gold and wheat and shadow. Then the train slowed. Ahead, just off the rails, sat a weathered building painted in once red that had faded into something closer to sigh. A diner. Round stools bolted to the floor, chrome trim dulled by dust. A wide, clean counter with only one cup of coffee sitting at the far end, steam curling like thought. But there were no doors. Only open air between the wall frames where doors should have been. The man stepped off the train anyway. As he crossed the threshold into the diner, the air changed. Cooler. Still. He took a seat at the counter. No one served him. But a plate appeared, a biscuit with honey, a slice of apple, and a cup of coffee that smelled of quiet mornings left behind. A folded napkin rested beside it with handwriting scrawled in blue ink. Take what you missed. Leave what you never needed. He ate slowly. No rush. No conversation. Just presence. When he finished, he stood and placed the pocket watch on the counter beside the plate. Not because he was done with it, but because it had done what it needed to do. The coffee was still warm when he left. Back aboard the train, the booth across from him sat empty again. But the scent of honey lingered faintly in the air, and the morning light followed the rails like an old friend. Part 12, the slowest mile. That afternoon, the train entered a stretch of land that seemed unchanged by weather or wind. Flat, still. No trees, no fences, just dry ground and sky stitched at the horizon. But something felt different. The rhythm of the wheels slowed, not in speed but in sound. Each turn of the rail gave a longer pause, a drawn-out breath, as if time itself were stretching, pulling thin between one thought and the next. The man looked up. There was no station, no stop, just a single white milepost, standing tall beside the track, hand-painted in soft black script. Mile 347. Take your time. He pressed his hand to the window. The outside world barely moved now. Grass leaned, not from wind, but from the memory of it. A bird perched on the mile marker didn't fly, just blinked once, slow as dusk. In this place, the train did not carry passengers. It waited with them. The man leaned back in his seat, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking of the next stop or the one before. Not of the glove or the pocket watch or the book. Just this moment. Just this mile. The light outside thickened to the color of honey on old wood. Time didn't stop. It simply stepped aside. And in that mile-long breath, the man found something he hadn't felt since the beginning of the line. Stillness. Part 13, the letter without a stamp. When the train resumed its regular rhythm, the man felt the difference, not in motion, but in meaning. Something had been left behind, though he couldn't name it. He only knew it had grown quiet inside him, like a lamp gently turned low. At the next small stop, a sign greeted him. Dunmore, no one arrives, everyone remembers. The station was little more than a bench beneath a tree and a single mailbox nailed to the trunk. The man stepped down and approached it slowly. The mailbox was open. Inside, resting in perfect stillness, was a letter. Addressed to no one. Stamped with nothing. Just a plain envelope sealed in wax, the color of rain. He picked it up. Turned it over. There were no words on the front or back. Only a faint impression where something once had been written and long since faded. It felt light but not empty. He held it a moment longer, then tucked it gently into the inner pocket of his coat, beside the book he still hadn't opened. Back on the train, the booth across from him remained unoccupied. But the seat was warm. The logbook rested between them, a few new names scrawled in the back pages. He didn't recognize them, but one line caught his eye. Left nothing, took only breath. He nodded once. A name didn't always need to be remembered. Sometimes, just the shape of the pause it left behind was enough. The train exhaled steam into the long stretch ahead, and the man sat quietly, a letter resting over his heart. Unread, but understood. Part 14, the house without footsteps. The sun had slipped behind the hills by the time the train slowed again. It didn't whistle. This train never did. It simply announced itself with hush and shadow, the way dreams arrive when you're already drifting. The man stepped off and found himself before a long gravel path that curved toward a quiet house perched on a slope above the tracks. Whitewashed, windowed, still. It wasn't grand, but it was waiting. He walked up slowly, boots brushing the gravel. The front door stood open, not wide, just enough to suggest you may. He entered. Inside, everything was familiar in a way that made his breath catch. A coat hung near the door that looked like one he'd once owned. A chair angled just so, with a worn spot in the armrest. A table set for one, with no meal, no cup. just set. But the strangest thing was the silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of moments that had once happened and no longer needed to. There were no footsteps in the dust. Not his, not anyone's. The house remembered every person who'd passed through it. But not with marks. With grace. He walked room to room. Didn't touch anything. But he nodded once slowly to the home, as if to say, yes, I remember too. When he left, the door closed softly behind him, though he hadn't touched it. The gravel crunched again as he returned to the train. Inside, the letter in his coat felt lighter, almost like it was exhaling. And the train pulled forward once more under stars that now watched more gently than before. Part 15, The Conductor Who Never Asked for Tickets. The train had rolled into another stretch of moonlit prairie, quiet, endless, and soft, the kind of night where nothing felt urgent, and the world itself seemed to be tucking you in. The man sat with his hand over his coat pocket, where the letter still rested. He hadn't opened it, didn't plan to, but it had begun to feel less like something hidden and more like something acknowledged. That was when he noticed the door at the end of the car slide open with a faint sigh. A man entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black with a narrow-brimmed hat and a long coat with brass buttons that had tarnished into dusk. He wore no badge, no bag, but he carried a small wooden pencil tucked behind one ear and a folded slip of paper in his hand. He didn't say a word, just nodded to the man, then sat in the booth opposite him. For a long while they rode like that, the air between them filled only with the quiet rhythm of steel and wind. Finally, the conductor unfolded his paper and slid it across the table. On it was written, "Have you been where you needed to go?" The man took the pencil, turned the paper over, and wrote, "Not yet, but I've stopped where I needed to rest." The conductor read it, nodded once, then stood. He didn't take a ticket, didn't offer one. He tipped his hat in thanks, to the answer, not the man, and exited through the far door. Gone again. The man looked out the window. A new moon had risen, barely a sliver, but enough to see by. He sat back in his seat, and the paper with their exchange gently folded itself in half. Part 16, The Station Made of Smoke. The train slowed as morning broke through a gauze of fog, gold and gray mingling like two old friends, unsure how to say goodbye. The man blinked slowly, adjusting to the softness of the light. Outside, a new station appeared, but not built of wood or stone. It was made entirely of smoke. Not illusion, not dream, just memory rising. The platform curled upward like incense, and the walls shimmered faintly in the breeze. Where the roof should have been, there was sky, and where the doors should have stood, only drifting curtains of ash. The train paused just long enough. The man stepped off and felt nothing beneath his boots, but he stood, just the same. A sign above the platform flickered into view, drawn from smoke itself. "This place remembers what you tried to forget." He didn't need to walk inside. The station wasn't meant for entering. It was meant for seeing. And see he did. He saw a coat he'd given away once, left folded on a fence post. He saw a meal he had never finished, still warm in a bowl. He saw an apology, spoken too late and yet still echoing. He saw a name he once whispered when no one was listening. The wind passed through him, not cold, just honest. He removed his hat and stood still until the smoke began to pull apart. And then the station faded, slowly, kindly, not as punishment, but as permission. The train gave a single exhale of steam, and he boarded once more. In his pocket, the letter shifted. He didn't need to open it. Now he knew what it said, and it had forgiven him anyway. 17. The sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dusty plains. The wind had kicked up, swirling the loose earth in small, erratic gusts that scratched at the skin. It wasn't a fierce wind, but one that carried with it the promise of something wild, something untamed. Maggie adjusted her hat, pulling it lower over her brow as she squinted at the horizon. Her horse, Dusty, stood beside her, head low, ears flicking back and forth, listening to the sounds of the desert. There was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She hadn't been back to this part of the land in years. The small town of Silver Creek had faded from her memory, replaced by the miles of barren desert that stretched endlessly in every direction. But now, here she was again. And the town, her town, was just ahead, hidden behind the hills like a secret waiting to be unearthed. Maggie had been hesitant to return. It wasn't fear that kept her away, it was the past. The people she had left behind, the things that had happened, the choices she had made. They had been buried long ago, or so she had thought. But something was pulling her back, something she couldn't ignore. As the horse moved forward, her boots crunching softly against the dry earth, she could see the outlines of the buildings in the distance. The saloon, the general store, and the small church that had always been the heart of Silver Creek. Everything seemed smaller now, faded by time and neglect, but it was still home in its own way. She could feel her heart quicken as the town grew closer. Memories flooded her, unbidden and fierce. The laughter of old friends, the scent of roasting meat in the evening, the sound of church bells ringing on a Sunday morning. But there were darker memories, too, ones she had tried to bury. Maggie's hand rested on the hilt of her pistol, a quiet reminder of the life she had left behind. She had always known this day would come, the moment when the past would catch up to her, when the choices she had made would finally demand an answer. Dusty slowed as they reached the edge of the town, and Maggie dismounted. Her boots hit the dirt with a soft thud, and she stood for a moment, surveying the scene. The town looked quieter than she remembered, the streets empty, the windows of the buildings dark and lifeless. It was as if the town itself had been holding its breath, waiting for her to return. Maggie walked down the main street, each step echoing in the stillness. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this. The town had always been bustling with life, the sound of voices and horses filling the air. Now it was as though the life had been drained from it, leaving behind only shadows. She reached the old saloon, its wooden doors hanging loosely on their hinges. The place had once been the center of town where stories were told and deals were made, but now it seemed like just another abandoned building, its walls sagging under the weight of time. Maggie pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the dim light from the dusty windows barely illuminated the room. The bar stood empty, the bottles behind it covered in layers of grime. Chairs were overturned, and the floor was littered with debris. It was as if no one had set foot inside for years. She took a step forward, the silence thick around her. Then a voice, soft and gravelly, came from the back of the room. "Well, I'll be damned." Part 18. Maggie took a step forward, her boots scraping against the wood floor as she crossed the threshold into the dim light of the saloon. She didn't flinch when Jake poured whiskey into 2 chipped glasses, the amber liquid catching the flicker of the fading daylight from the cracked windows. Her eyes never left him, her face a mask of quiet determination. Jake slid one of the glasses toward her. It was an old habit, an old ritual from when things had been simpler, before the dust had settled into their lives and the warmth had drained from the town like the last of the sun. Maggie didn't reach for the drink right away. She studied it for a moment, the faintest of memories stirring. There had been nights, many years ago, when this same glass had been filled with laughter, with promises made and broken, with stories of the future. But that was a lifetime ago, a different world. Now everything felt like a ghost. "You're not the girl I remember," Jake said suddenly, his voice thick with something unspoken. "You've changed, Maggie. Been through things I couldn't even imagine." "I'm not that girl anymore," she replied, her voice firm, though it cracked just a little. "And neither are you." Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat down on one of the old bar stools, his eyes drifting toward the window where the last slivers of sunlight were swallowed by the darkening sky. "There's a lot of things you don't know, things I never told you," Jake said finally. "Things I wish I could forget. But the past's a stubborn thing. It won't let you go." Maggie crossed her arms, her gaze still fixed on him. "Tell me. I need to hear it." Jake exhaled slowly, the weight of the years in the sound of his breath. It was a deal, a simple one at first. Some cattle, some land, a little whiskey, a lot of bad decisions, and all the while we thought we had it made. Thought Silver Creek was untouchable. Maggie's heart gave a jolt at the mention of the deal. She had heard whispers of it in the years she had spent away. The stories of land disputes, of power-hungry men wanting more than what the small town could offer. But she had never known the details, never understood how far things had gone. Jake took a drink from his glass, the liquid settling in his chest like a long-forgotten memory. The problem was, we didn't know who we were dealing with. They weren't just local men, they were from outside the town. Folks with more money, more power than we could imagine. And they came here with plans. Plans that weren't about cattle or whiskey. Maggie leaned in, her pulse quickening. What kind of plans? Jake's gaze darkened. He set the glass down, his hands trembling slightly. Plans to take over. To control Silver Creek. They wanted the land, Maggie. They wanted everything we had. And when we refused to play along, they didn't stop. They brought in mercenaries, men who didn't care about this town or its people. They came for us, and they took everything. The weight of his words hit Maggie like a hammer. She had heard rumors, of course, about the people who had come to Silver Creek, about the violence that had followed. But to hear it from Jake's mouth, to know how deep the betrayal ran, made everything feel real in a way she wasn't ready for. So, that's what happened, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. They destroyed it all. Jake nodded, his face hardening. Not just the town. They destroyed the people. They took lives, ruined families, and no one fought back. We were too broken by then, too divided. Maggie's chest tightened. She had always known Silver Creek wasn't the same when she had left, but to hear that it had fallen apart like this, it was more than she could bear. "And you?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You just let it happen?" Jake flinched, his eyes darkening. It wasn't that simple. When they came, there was no one left to fight. The people you remember, they were gone, Maggie. Those who stayed behind, they were all too scared, too tired to stand up. I tried to fight, but there was no one left. Maggie could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, the years of regret and sorrow settling heavily in the air between them. She wanted to feel angry, to lash out at him for letting this happen, but the truth was she didn't know what else anyone could have done. She set the glass of whiskey down without drinking from it, her fingers brushing the edge lightly. So what now? What happens to this town? Jake leaned back in his chair, his eyes turning distant. I don't know. The land's been taken and the people who stayed, they've scattered. But there's still something here, Maggie. Something we can fix. Maybe not all of it, but maybe enough. Maggie stared at him, the heaviness of his words sinking in. Maybe there was a chance. Maybe there was something worth saving. But first, they needed to deal with the men who had taken everything from them. Part 19. The night had fully settled over Silver Creek, and the stars twinkled above like 1,000 silent witnesses to the town's forgotten glory. Maggie sat at the edge of the saloon's broken porch, staring out over the darkened land. She had come back seeking answers, but now, standing on the precipice of the past, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. Jake had told her more than she had expected. The betrayal, the wreckage, the broken promises, it was all laid bare now. But there was something else, something unspoken that lingered between them, something both hopeful and dangerous. "Do you think we can fix it?" Maggie asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. Jake stood next to her, his back straight, and his jaw clenched as if trying to will the past into submission. He didn't speak right away, his eyes scanning the land that had once been so full of life. "I don't know," he said, after a long pause, his voice gruff. "But we can try. We've got one shot at this, Maggie. It's either do something or let it all go to dust." Maggie stood up, her mind racing. There was no going back now. The decision had been made. If they were going to save what was left of Silver Creek, they would have to do it together. Part 20? The following days were a blur of preparations. Maggie and Jake spent hours in the saloon, poring over old maps, discussing what little they knew about the men who had taken control of the town. Word had spread through what little remained of Silver Creek. Those who hadn't left were beginning to return, slowly but surely. Some came because they had nowhere else to go. Others, like Maggie, came with a renewed sense of purpose. By the end of the week, the old saloon was buzzing with activity. A plan had been forged. It wasn't much, but it was something, a beginning. Maggie stood in the center of the room, her eyes scanning the faces around her. There were only a few of them, men and women, mostly farmers, ranchers, and old-town folk who had been too stubborn to leave. But each one had a fire in their eyes that spoke volumes. "Silver Creek ain't dead yet," Maggie said, her voice carrying across the room. "We've got a chance to take it back. It's going to be hard, it's going to be dirty, but we're not going to give up without a fight." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others tightening their hands into fists. It was a small group, but it was all they had. Part 21. The plan was simple. Maggie, Jake, and the few remaining townsfolk would first gather intel, find out where the mercenaries were holed up, learn who was in charge, and gather whatever weapons they could get their hands on. But it wouldn't be easy. The mercenaries were ruthless, and the men who had taken control of Silver Creek were not the sort to back down without a fight. Maggie met with each of them individually, making sure they were ready. Her determination was unwavering, but she could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't a battle they had expected to fight, and most of them had no experience in something like this. Jake, however, seemed different. There was a calm in him now, a steadiness that had been absent when they had first met again. He had a plan and he knew how to execute it. "This town is our home," Jake said as he went over the final details of the plan with Maggie. "We're going to take it back, piece by piece. And once we do, we'll rebuild. We'll make sure this never happens again." Maggie nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm with you. Let's get started." Part 22. It took them another week to gather the necessary resources. They had to be careful, keeping everything under wraps while the mercenaries patrolled the area. But finally the day arrived. The small group of townsfolk, armed with rifles, shotguns, and whatever else they could find, gathered just outside Silver Creek's borders. Their hearts were racing, their nerves on edge, but they were ready. Maggie stood at the front, her eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the signal. The first wave was a scouting party. Jake and Maggie had decided to take out the smaller, more vulnerable posts first, sabotaging their food supply, cutting off their communication lines, and weakening their morale. It wasn't about winning the battle all at once, it was about slowly chipping away at the mercenaries' control. The first skirmish was small, a quick raid on a few of the men who were stationed outside the town. But it was enough to send a message. Part 23. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Silver Creek's resolve grew stronger. The mercenaries were confused, disorganized, and unsure of what was happening. The small, seemingly insignificant attacks had left them vulnerable, and soon enough, the remaining townsfolk had gathered enough courage to push forward. Maggie stood in front of the old church, looking out over the town she had once called home. It wasn't the way it had been before. No, that would never happen again. But it was something. It was theirs. "We've come this far," Maggie said to the group gathered around her. "Now we finish what we started." Part 24. The final confrontation was swift. The mercenaries, caught off guard by the strength of the resistance, made their last stand in the town's center. Guns were drawn, and the sounds of the conflict echoed through the streets. But it was over quickly. The mercenaries were outnumbered, and the people of Silver Creek had found their strength. When the dust settled, the town was theirs again. Jake and Maggie stood together in the middle of the street, looking around at the damage. The buildings were still standing, but there was a lot of work to do. It was far from perfect, but it was a beginning. "We did it," Maggie said, her voice quiet with disbelief. "We did," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Now we rebuild." Part 25. The days that followed were filled with hard work. The saloon was cleaned, the church repaired, and the general store was restocked. One by one, the townsfolk returned, rebuilding not just their homes, but their lives. Silver Creek would never be the town it had been, but it would be something new. A place where the past was acknowledged, but the future held promise. As for Maggie, she stayed. There was no more running, no more searching. She had found her place in the world once again, among the people who had always been her family. And Silver Creek? It was more than just a town now. It was a symbol of resilience, of the strength found in community, and of the unwavering will to rebuild, no matter how far the road had been. Part 26. The first light of dawn broke through the hills, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Silver Creek. Maggie stood on the porch of the old saloon, the weight of the past few weeks heavy on her shoulders. It wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. The townspeople had begun working together to rebuild their homes, their stores, and their lives. The wounds of the past were still fresh, but they were healing, bit by bit. Each brick laid, each nail hammered was a step toward something better. Maggie was working alongside them, her hands calloused from the labor, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she passed by the church, she saw Jake talking to a group of the older folks. Their faces were weathered by time, but there was a spark in their eyes now, something that had been missing before. "What's next, Maggie?" Jake asked as she approached. "We keep building," she replied simply. "One day at a time." Part 27. By the end of the second month, Silver Creek was starting to resemble something close to its former self. The once empty streets were now filled with people going about their daily tasks. Children played in the dust, men and women worked together to repair roofs and fix fences, and the saloon was no longer a place of memories, but a place of meeting and conversation. Maggie couldn't help but smile as she watched the town come back to life. The people were starting to laugh again, to talk to one another without the heavy silence that had once filled the air. The weight of the mercenaries' reign had been lifted, and the town felt like it was breathing again. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Jake said, standing beside her as they watched a group of kids run by. He was holding a cup of coffee, his usual gruff expression softened by the warmth of the morning. "It does," Maggie agreed, her eyes lingering on the town. "I think we've finally found what we were looking for." Part 28. But the peace was fragile. Word had spread through the region about Silver Creek's victory over the mercenaries, and though many of the townspeople were hopeful, there were still some who remained wary. Not everyone was pleased with the way things had turned out. One evening, as Maggie was walking back from the general store, she was stopped by a man she didn't recognize. He was older, grizzled, with a scar running down the side of his face. He stood in the shadows, watching her approach. "You're the one leading this town now, ain't you?" he asked, his voice rough, almost a growl. Maggie stopped, wary. "What do you want?" "I've heard the stories," he said, stepping forward slightly, "about how you and your people fought off the mercenaries. But I don't trust it. You're rebuilding this place, but for what? What's the point of bringing Silver Creek back from the dead if it's just going to end up like it was before?" Maggie met his gaze, her eyes steady. "We're not going to let that happen. Not again." The man grunted, eyes narrowing. "You can't change the past, girl. You're just pushing sand up a hill. It'll slip away eventually." Maggie felt a chill in the air, but she stood firm. "Maybe, but we'll do what we can. For us, for the people who are still here. And that's enough." The man didn't respond, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned and disappeared into the night. Part 29. The encounter left Maggie uneasy. She couldn't ignore the man's words. They echoed in the back of her mind, a warning that no matter how much they rebuilt, the past would always be there, looming over them. She knew the town still had enemies, and there were those who would want to see it fail. Jake noticed the change in her the next morning. "What happened?" he asked, noticing the tension in her posture. "A man stopped me last night," Maggie said, her voice heavy. "He didn't trust us, said we were just wasting our time. It made me wonder if he was right." Jake shook his head. "Don't listen to him. Silver Creek's stronger than that. People have always come back from worse." "I hope you're right," Maggie replied, staring out across the town. "But there's something else. Something we can't ignore." Part 30. As the weeks passed, Maggie kept her eyes open for any signs of trouble. The man's warning had unsettled her, and the last thing she wanted was for Silver Creek's revival to be short-lived. The quiet, everyday tasks were still being completed. The work was steady, but a feeling of unease settled over the town. One evening, Jake rode out to meet a few of the neighboring ranchers, and Maggie took the opportunity to visit the old town cemetery. It had been years since she had been there, but it was important. The cemetery was the heart of Silver Creek, a place where the souls of the town's past had been laid to rest. As Maggie walked among the gravestones, she felt a sense of connection to the town's history. She could almost hear the voices of the past, of those who had lived and loved and fought here long before the mercenaries had come. She knelt beside the grave of her parents, the stone worn and faded. "I hope you're proud of what we're doing," she whispered. "We're trying to make this town something worth believing in." Part 31. It wasn't long before things took a turn. The night after Maggie's visit to the cemetery, there was a loud crash outside the saloon. She rushed to the door to find a group of men, dressed in dark coats, standing in front of the building. They were armed, their faces obscured by the low light. "We've heard the stories," one of them called out, his voice carrying in the cool night air. "You've got a town here, but it's not yours, and we're here to take it." Maggie stepped forward, her hand resting on her pistol. "This is Silver Creek. You're not welcome here." The leader of the group laughed, a low, menacing sound. "We don't care about your town, lady. We care about the land, and it's ours now." The standoff was brief. The townsfolk quickly gathered, standing together with rifles and shotguns in hand. The men who had come to claim Silver Creek realized they weren't dealing with easy prey. With a few tense moments, the intruders turned and fled, but the threat was far from over. Part 32. The attack had been a wake-up call for Maggie and the people of Silver Creek. It wasn't just mercenaries who had their eyes on the town, it was anyone who saw an opportunity to take what wasn't theirs. Jake was furious, but Maggie remained calm. "We'll stand our ground," she said, her voice firm. "No one's taking Silver Creek. Not again." The next few days were spent fortifying the town, preparing for whatever came next. More people came in from surrounding areas, seeking refuge and offering assistance. The town had become a symbol of resistance, and the people were determined not to let it fall. Part 33. By the time the next wave of attackers arrived, Silver Creek was ready. This time, there was no hesitation. The townsfolk had fortified their homes and the streets, prepared to defend everything they had fought for. The battle was fierce, but this time it was different. The attackers weren't just fighting a town, they were fighting a community that had found its strength, its purpose. Maggie stood at the front, her heart steady as the gunfire echoed through the streets. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, and Silver Creek was her home. Thank you for joining me in this adventure through Silver Creek. I hope this story gave you the warmth and comfort you needed tonight. As always, if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And remember, even in the darkest times, there's always a light ahead. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next story.